All right, welcome back, friends. Daniel here with Professor Stephen MacKinnon at Arizona State University. Stephen, welcome to our program. This is a bit of a unique show. What we're going to give to you here, we're spotlighting a lesser-known American radical, Agnes Smedley, and I was compelled to reach out to Stephen to see if he'd chat with me about this book you can see here on the screen called Agnes Smedley, The Life and Times of an American Radical. After reading Agnes's book, Daughter of Earth, which is a sort of semi-autobiographical, semi-memoir, but also fictional portrayal of Dust Bowl era, her own life of her youth in poverty, born in rural Missouri. And Agnes went on to lead a life which is quite remarkable and which is quite, in my opinion, not too well known. So part of our objective is just to share a bit about her incredible escapades around the world. And Stephen, could we begin with you giving a sense of when you first learned about Agnes Smedley and what compelled you to write this book on her?
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for the invitation and for the attention to Agnes Smedley, who is less well known in her motherland, in her home country. In some ways, internationally, she's has a bigger reputation, and we can talk about that as a kind of siren heroine. Not exactly feminist, but radical feminist, socialist heroine that resonates in all kinds of languages, in all kinds of places. The translations of her work, indeed of our book too, demonstrate that. Not just in China. China is huge because that's where she ends up a lot in her career. Now, how I got interested is a personal story. I'm kind of old now. People tell me I'm in my 80s, and I was moving from Berkeley, California, to Arizona to take a teaching job. And I had been in Berkeley in the late 60s, and I don't need to recall the atmosphere there, but it was, wild, and there was a lot of leftist things going on, in which my wife and I were involved. We had two young children. One, the oldest, was born in Berkeley in 1969, amidst tear gas and God knows what, and so on. And so my wife, who was an activist of sorts, says, "What the hell are we doing going to Phoenix, basically, to that place?" And Arizona's reputation for right-wingness is still with us, as you know, especially if say, you live out in New York City or someplace. And I said, well, it can't be all that bad, I say to her, because Agnes Smedley came from there. She said, "What? Who is Agnes Smedley?" This is in about 1971, 72. And I said, well, I tried to give her a rough picture, but she read Daughter of Earth almost right away. It had just been reprinted, or maybe it hadn't yet been reprinted. We got all involved with the feminist press in its origins, its early years, because Agnes Smedley was one of their first publications. So she said, "Wow." And if you remember at the beginning of Daughter of Earth, there's 10 or 15 pages about Tempe, Arizona, and the Yaqui Indian community just to the north, which is still here, by the way, and all of that. So that is really what kind of engineered the beginning of an adventure with Agnes Smedley. I had been a scholar, was a hopeful scholar of modern Chinese history, working on a book at the time about the late Qing dynasty, so it wasn't exactly the same subject. But my wife got interested in it, and we began to decide that we would somehow take her on as a joint project, because we began to find records of her here in Arizona, where she attended for about 2 years, but also we began to explore and discover access to some papers in upstate New York controlled by a political refugee from the McCarthy period who lived in Mexico City. Anyway, things began to kind of grow in this way as a joint project of the two of us. Now, my wife is named Janice Rachi McKinnon, and she died suddenly in 1999. She's deceased, and it was a great blow to me, of course, and my children.
Sorry to hear that.
I have, but we anyway began to engage in this project. Beginning by the mid 70s, we edited a little book called Portraits of Chinese Women in Revolution, I believe it's called, that also Feminist Press published, which is a selection of Smedley's pieces about Chinese women, and that kind of got us launched. It was and we began to work on it. Then later, traveling here and there. One of the aspects of it was that Smedley had an involvement, from you can know from reading Daughter of Earth, with the Indian nationalist movement. India, South Asia, I mean, when I say Indian. So we wanted to go to India to work on her, and tried to get a Fulbright, a research Fulbright to India. And Washington was not interested in our application. Who is Agnes Smedley? Oh my God, some crazy leftist, so on. But somehow our papers got to New Delhi. Bingo. Because she knew everybody who was important ultimately in the Indian nationalist movement, except Gandhi. She was not
right.
The Gandhi. She was with the overseas refugees. But Nehru, for instance,
Right.
his Sarojini Naidu, who became the most prominent woman politician in India, was the sister of Smedley's common law husband in Berlin, and so on. So we began to make discoveries like that. It was a voyage of discovery, really, putting all this together. Writing a book with your wife or husband, your spouse, I must say, in retrospect, it was a tricky matter, and we had ups and downs, because if you write jointly with somebody else, you kind of correspond and so on. But if you're arguing about sentences on Saturday night at 3 a.m., it's in the bedroom or something.
Yep.
It's kind of wild. So it was
Sure.
It was a heady experience, but it ultimately turned out well.
That's fabulous. Thank you for that. That's it's quite interesting that she did manage to become a global sort of persona on the left, and that was part of what always sort of surprised me in reading Daughter of Earth, especially given her modest background, and the fact that Daughter of Earth portrays that. It's a bit like Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. I mean, it's a bit of a radicalizing text in a certain way, and you can perhaps see that life that her family was forced into, which, just to give you a sense of it, I don't think that she exaggerates. I mean, she's talking about how they were constantly moving for different work opportunities. They had dilapidated housing. The women would often die in their late 30s from overwork and exhaustion. The men that we come to learn, actually, that she was near or proximal to the great Ludlow Massacre, Union Massacre, and the book documents the degradation that the workers faced in those conditions. So in that way, it doesn't need to take an ideological line in theory, in Marxist theory or whatever, but it connects at this human level in a way which is quite radical, and which I think shapes her in such a deep way that that's part of what I identified with her. I connected with her. I resonated with her, and that's why I wanted to talk to you. But maybe we could take a step back and say something about how it was possible that Agnes Smedley went from such a horrific background into this international woman of mystery. How did that happen? Can you give us a rundown?
Well, it is remarkable and unusual, and I'm not sure I have an easy explanation. Most of the great journalists or even international activists, like Reed or somebody, but also in the case of China, Edgar Snow, but also Theodore White or I don't know, whoever, come from middle class backgrounds. Obviously, probably went to college. And so on. And so her case is of really self-education in many respects, and how she pulled out of this, as you said, very rough background. Her aunt was, I think, was a prostitute. For example, her mother had a very bad time, and the father was kind of a wild man, and so on. So that there was something rebellious in her. I think she had some breaks, perhaps here and there. Her one of her father's big drinking friends in the mining towns ended up outside of Arizona Globe, where there's still mines, and she at 16 or 17 was teaching high school, even though she was barely a high school graduate herself, in small towns on her own, kind of run away from home, really. But she wanted, this guy told her to come see him, and it was a big buck, was what she called him. And he was, of course, 20 years older. He proposed marriage, and she flatly turned him down. But he said, well, here's some money. You go into the school in Phoenix, which was a teacher's college, full of Mormon, almost all Mormon women, ranchers' wives, essentially. That was the beginning of a kind of self-education, but she was a natural writer somehow. I mean, that must have self-taught, because she was in the literary society, for goodness sake, and she came into Phoenix wearing a 6-gun. None of these polite rancher Mormon girls were carrying 6-guns. So she was remarkable, but she immediately kind of got into the student press a little bit, but then she got totally, and I don't know how the mixture goes exactly, but Emma Goldman was running around California at this time, and there's a connection with Emma Goldman, I think, spiritually perhaps at first, but she did meet her. And then they became friendly much later in Germany, really. But the Emma Goldman sort of spirit was, she picked up on that as a maybe not a model, but anyway, she took off. But it was self-education in a remarkable way that is hard to explain. I'm trying to think of parallels that are more contemporary to us, of people who emerge as major writers, because in a way she became. The Knopf was publishing her books by the 1940s.
Well, yeah, they say in the when the Soviet Union fell, in the literary archives, there was two American authors that the Bolsheviks, the Soviets, had enshrined. It was John Reed and Agnes Smedley.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that, yeah. So there's and then of course in Daughter of Earth there is that scene you may remember where I think Emma Goldman gives a speech which she listens to, she hears it. So there must have been some mesmerizing cathextion of some sort there. And then also her first husband was a socialist. Is that right?
That's true. Yeah, and his sister, who we ultimately found in a rest home in Florida in the 70s, was I think a big influence on her too. The two of them, and they were but flat out sort of parlor room socialists. They were, and so this idea of class. But not in a, as you were sort of saying, a classic sort of straight Marxist. She wasn't suddenly hanging out with ideologues, unless you want to call Emma Goldman an ideologue.
Well, some people have suggested that later on Emma Goldman had a bit of a break with Smedley because Emma didn't support Maoism.
Yeah,
and we'll get to that in a moment, but there may be some bit of a rift, but I think that they did pretty much have a strong relationship throughout. And then so she marries her first husband, who's a socialist, and that allows her to enter into ultimately the New York, Greenwich Village Bohemian scene, right?
yeah.
And then from there she networks, and that's really where she begins to make her mark as a writer. Is that right?
That's probably right. She wrote for The Call, which was a socialist newspaper in New York, as an interesting socialist newspaper. Some of the writers who later wrote for the communist, the American Communist Party organs were there. One guy, Robert, I forget. Anyway, I think what happened in New York, yes, she got connected a bit with the Indian nationalist movement in California, uh, and then moved to New York, and some combination of the Indian nationalist movement, especially a guy named Rajpat Rai, uh, and she had some contact with the Sikh movement in California, which was more radical actually than the sort of mainstream, just pure nationalist movement. The Sikhs wanted to import guns and fight the British in India, which didn't get anywhere, of course. But at that time, but
Right.
but this combination, and I think the sympathy for Indian nationalism vis-a-vis the British blended in if you knew something about the parlor room socialist types in New York, who were all upper class or upper class to upper middle class, uh, were sympathetic. So that's where she hooked in with Margaret Sanger, and the
Yep.
feminist issues. I hadn't said that earlier, and it's sort of clear from Daughter of Earth, although a little murky, that she clearly had some kind of abortions, uh, through the, and was shocked the whole sex and results thereof, and the position of women in this respect also was part of her education, I think. I mean, she actually, her breakup of her first marriage was amicable. She stayed in touch with the family the rest of her life. Actually, I interviewed the guy's later wife, or we did, and so on in California. So so that kind of feminism was, that's how she met Sanger, because Sanger was running around also in this Indian nationalist crowd. And she soon became Sanger's secretary, as well as a sort of a corresponding secretary of this guy, Lajpat Rai, who was later assassinated in India in the late 20s.
And this Rajpat Pai, his organization was modeled off of the IWW in terms of their tactics. This is what I've read. That the
I think you're mixing up with the Sikhs. The Sikhs were
the
modeled
Sikhs
after
were
that.
okay. The Sikhs were
The
okay.
Sikhs
Oh,
were
they were
more,
the more radical
they
ones.
were the more radical. Well, right.
I
I
see.
mean, the whole complex. This is a whole different
Right.
complex subject
Right.
of
Right.
Indian refugee politics. The Rai was closer to a Gandhi position almost, although not exactly nonviolent. But he wanted to push push the push the British out with a nationalist sort of uprising, but not through violence exactly. Uh, the people she got involved with in Germany later in the 20s, because remember, Smedley then gets arrested and thrown in the tombs for with a lot of British help with our DOJ, so to speak, uh, saying that she was a dangerous radical, and was out to overthrow the American government somehow, but also for violating birth control laws. That
Right.
the advocacy of the birth control. So that she got out of prison ultimately with I think Margaret Sanger and others. Uh, 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 but she wrote some wonderful articles about the tombs,
Mm.
and she met the founder of the ACLU, in the tombs, uh,
Mm.
and Robert was Baldwin, right? I got that wrong, last name, I think, maybe not Robert, but anyway, Baldwin,
Hmm.
uh, and so on. So that put her right in this sort of socialist jet set,
Yep.
and she became pretty well known then with that. And I think the beginning of some of her autobiographical writing comes out of that.
Wow.
But
Yeah.
these were all highly educated people, and she
Yeah.
had been self-educated. And I think they did see her as kind of an artifact, practically, of the working, of these what we call redneck poor. We're really not talking about
Right.
classic manufacturing or working class labor union people. We're talking about, redneck people today. We would talk about as Trumpers.
Right. Right. Yeah. Exactly. And that's actually why, because I mean, in a way, she was kind of an American peasant, in a way, and
Yeah,
you know, I
she
don't know if
thought
that's
of
the right
herself that way.
classification, but
That's a good point. Yeah.
and that's actually interesting because she was so connected to the Chinese communists, and they were working with peasants so in such a central way. So it kind of makes sense why she identified, and especially when you read her biography that she wrote of Chu Te, the general of the Chinese Communist Red Army. You really see a lot of the solidarity that the two of them had
Hmm.
about their shared background, even though one's from China, one's from America. Um, and the Margaret Sanger piece is interesting because Margaret Sanger is one of the first advocates of birth control, and Smedley connected to that cause for very personal reasons. And
I think so. Yeah.
yeah, and I think you're probably right. That's what I felt when I was reading Daughter of Earth, that it seemed that there must have been some experiences that she's had. Um, and one of the reasons that I also was drawn to Agnes Smedley is because she underwent psychoanalysis when she went from New York to Germany, and she was in Berlin. Um, and during that time, she underwent psychoanalysis, and it was pretty much very difficult because she was begging her kind of richer friends to help give her money so she could remain in Berlin. She was getting some money by publishing articles in places like The Nation magazine and others,
Hmm.
um, but it wasn't enough to afford psychoanalysis. And but I think that your view is that psychoanalysis that she received was pretty transformative for her.
I think so. Yes, that's what we thought. It was also right at the time, Freud was still alive. Elizabeth Naif, the 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 chief woman, she was a protege of Freud's directly, as I understand it. She's a bit of a mystery in some ways, but I wish I knew more about her. I think she died in the war, by the 30s and stuff. But anyway, the it was very transformative because Smedley had a complete sort of mental, breakdown, for sure, and this helped her enormously to get out. She was, as you said, scrambling, got help. This famous Tilia Durer, famous actress at the time. This is connected to the whole Brecht circle. And so on, was a kind of protege. Kathy Kowitz, the very important, as a wonderful, we put it in the book, a portrait of Smedley, actually, in hospital bed in the middle of the breakdown, I believe. Anyway, it was important, and I think that the writing of Daughter of the Earth was part of her recovery. I mean, it was
so
a
she
way.
wrote Daughter of Earth after
Daughter of Earth after the crack up, yeah, I think. In some ways, coming out of it. But anyway, the writing of Daughter of Earth, I think, was therapeutic in that sense. She went off to an island in Denmark with again a very well-known Danish. I think I've got it right. Karen Miklas, and finished the book sort of there.
Yeah.
But her old connections with New York, like with Malcolm Crowley, who was a really big deal at that time.
Yeah, in the literary establishment.
Took an interest in her, and that was very helpful. But polishing and putting it together, I've often wondered how I did. Probably Crowley and some others must have helped at the end a bit, but she was still really in Berlin, you see, during all of this, or in and out of Europe.
So what happened when Daughter of Earth was published? Can you talk about its reception?
It came out. Yeah, thank you. I don't mean to jump in. I got your question. It was published, unless I'm wrong, but I think in 1929, and it was published. And by this time, Smedley was on her way to China. But it was published in English and in German almost simultaneously. So there was a German translation that came out right at the same time. They might be slightly different. That's a good question. But Cowley had, I think, a lot to getting it, and it wasn't published just in a leftist press. I forget the initial publisher. It was a progressive press, but it was. Like I've forgotten the original publisher, but it got reviewed fairly widely. I'm not sure about the New York Times, but in the Village Voice or what have you, and was really kind of an overnight. It drew a lot of attention. It's a unique book, especially if you think of it from that at that time. Reading it today, it's read as a sort of feminist track in some circles, but as you've already suggested, there are many elements to it because it plugs into nationalism, anti-imperialism, working class, not working class as we say, really redneck American peasant miners and the exploitation of the West. And so
family dynamics. I mean, you can already get a sense as to why she developed such a strong critique of patriarchy because of the abusive behavior of her own father.
Yes, right. Yeah, of course, her father was very abusive, especially of her mother, and so on. Yeah, that's right. Also, the book, I think, still has an appeal today. It still gets reprinted and has gone through editions, as they say, around the world, because it also is the beginning of, maybe it hit at the right time about reporting of journalists doing the personal and reporting at the same time. The personal and international. At least she wrote as a journalist for the Guardian and other places. And the Frankfurter Zeitung was what she went out to China to write for. she'd write in English, it'd get translated into German, and of course she had pretty good German by the time she left Germany, I think, but didn't write in German really, I don't think. Anyway, but it would be mixture with her own experiences and the events she was reporting on, you know. And this kind of style now has been adopted widely, right?
Yeah.
This kind of journalism. So she was almost a pioneer in this by accident, you might say.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And the other place that really where the book was very successful was when it was translated into Russian.
Right.
Because
you know more about that than I do, really.
Well, I had read in another book on Smedley that when she went to visit, she first of all, it was a very successful visit. She did meet a lot of the more senior Bolshevik leaders, and there was a certain feeling that they had that her whole message, you know, from her background with her book, and was something that they wanted to celebrate and so they translated it, and I forget the number, but there was many copies sold. From what I understand, there was talk about making it into a film in the Soviet film industry, which was pretty significant as well.
Yeah, this would be in 33, 34 you're talking about, I think. Yeah.
And then of course there's all of the assumptions, which I think you and your late wife have disproven, that she was a spy for the Soviets.
Right. Yeah. That there is another biography that came out by Ruth Price, who of course we knew, and it's actually pretty good about her early life, because Ruth Price dug in more into Colorado and so on. And some parts of that are really pretty good. But she somehow, well, in the 90s, got onto this idea, partially through these publications that Yale Press has been publishing a lot about the Comintern archives and people with different names, and who was, you know, that various Americans were spies. It kind of revolved around the Alger Hiss issue and Whittaker Chambers and so on. And the idea that Smedley actually was first worked for the German government and then was working for Moscow, so to speak, as a spy and on. And at the same time as she was active as a writer. There's actually a recent portrait of her by a man named John Sexton, a chapter or two in a book that just came out last year or this year, not very long ago, portraying different figures. But he dug back into the Comintern archives, and it pretty much supports our view that, yes, she did. She had more of an involvement with the Comintern than we realized. You know, there was connections, but she was so much of a loose cannon that they did not trust her with anything, and she was hardly a spy. They saw her as at best a propagandist, so to speak, for world revolution or anti-imperialism or what have you. And then she fell out with them badly by the mid-30s.
Right.
And so her relation with the American Communist Party, which she had some relationship with, although she was never a member, with Browder and these people, just totally collapsed by the late 30s and 1940s. And they saw her as just, you know, a loose cannon, and with, you know, some exceptions, of course, I guess, as individuals. But you're right. I think our position has been, we went a little too far by saying that she had no relations with the Comintern, because we never found any. We heard people talk about it, but and we saw her FBI papers, which were not clear. I mean, Chambers is hard to believe, and so forth. But I think there was some connection for a little while in Berlin in the late 20s, and in China in the definitely 30s. And this guy Richard Sorge, of course, was a major spy, and so her association with him uh, is in some ways the grounds really like there's a public television or series on great American spies or
Yeah.
something like that, and by God, they've got Smedley in there, which I
Why
think is
don't you tell
really,
us a bit
really
about Richard Sorge, please?
So Richard Sorge is a huge hero in the international intelligence world. There's recently another good book about him, using a lot more of the Russian sources, I think, and he was originally a Russian, but of Russian German sort of background. His family went back to Lenin in various ways. But he comes to China initially, working really for the Red Army, although everybody who was on the left in China thought he was in the Comintern. And he was being a German journalist at a high level, and he interacted with German officials. There was a big German aid to Chiang Kai-shek at the time, military and one thing or another. And his job was to report on what Chiang Kai-shek was doing vis-a-vis the border with Russia, really. I think that was probably his job. But he also was a major figure within the leftist circles in Shanghai, but not trying to associate too directly all the time, because his cover was as this German journalist. And he was a very romantic figure. He blasted around town on a big motorcycle, and Smedley definitely fell in love with him. I mean, I think probably she is, he was one of the loves of her life, definitely. There was the earlier Indian figure, and then the earlier husband, and so on. Sorge, about the time that Smedley was in, they didn't see each other after, say, 1933. He ultimately goes back to Moscow, leaves Moscow to go to Tokyo as a high-level journalist, but really making reports directly to Moscow of what the Japanese military buildup is all about and what it means for Russia. And that meant that he missed Stalin's purges. And was protected within the Red Army, so that he ends up in the up through the 40s at a very high level as the political officer in the German embassy in Tokyo, while making radio reports to Moscow about what the Japanese are doing. Amazing. Ultimately, he and his and he had a very high-level Japanese who was also a good friend of Smedley's from Shanghai, named Ishigaki, who was Prince Konoe's top China advisor, also in the Comintern, connected to Moscow. Mm-hmm. And the two of them were finally caught and hanged by the end of the war.
Mm.
But Sorge is still celebrated certainly in Russia, even Russian post-Soviet circles, mm-hmm. As an amazing figure. He was a romantic kind of guy. He had a lot of ladies, and I think it was a Japanese lady that finally got him in trouble in Tokyo in 42 or 43 when he was finally arrested. Yeah. But he was important to Smedley, and they lived together sometimes in 32, 33, in that period in Shanghai. So this relationship with Sorge, you could say, in some people's eyes, tainted Smedley as being part of a spy ring. And MacArthur, people in the late 40s, attacks her built upon the Sorge, connection.
I see. That makes sense. Can we take a step back and just tell us about Smedley's entry into China, the context of the Chinese Revolution, which really went on for so many decades and was such an ongoing war, civil war, etc. At what point does she enter, and where does she go?
She enters China, going the Trans-Siberian Railroad down into Manchuria. I think she thought originally maybe that she was going to go from China to India somehow, because she was still fixated on India in some ways when she left Berlin, although there were some Chinese contacts. But she gets to Manchuria, and she writes about this herself very, very movingly. She sees the poverty of the people, in contrast to sort of the warlords and the Japanese who were already into Manchuria at that time, and begins to, it was cathartic, I think, and she writes about it that way. Moves down then into China itself. Again, she was writing for the Frankfurter Zeitung, which is still a leading German newspaper. I mean, it's sort of the New York Times. I mean, and so she is writing for them, going down to Nanjing. She's actually there, as I recall, around the time of Sun Yat-sen's funeral. Sun Yat-sen being the sort of father of the revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty and so on. Anyway, she moves to Shanghai, which was the center of political activity in China, especially on the left, but actually all kinds of political activity, and had just sort of been taken over by Chiang Kai-shek's group in 29-30. She meets, and in that picture you just showed, she meets Sung Jingling, the widow. The woman in the middle of that picture is Sung Jingling, or Madame Sung, one of the three Sung sisters, one of whom married Chiang Kai-shek, one of whom married Sun Yat-sen, and another one who married a very prominent figure named Mr. Kung. And Sung Jingling moved to the left after the death of her husband, and in fact, surreptitiously did join the Comintern in some fashion. It's a very complicated story about Chinese politics and so on, but she became kind of emblematic of the opposition to Chiang Kai-shek's sort of military rule, and a leftist opposition. And Smedley became her, of course. They were quite close for a while. They did have a falling out after a while, but anyway, and she became she couldn't be one of the people in this picture was assassinated 3 months later, and another one, Lu Xun, on the far right, is 20th century China's most important writer. He's still cited today in China by Chinese leadership. And he died in 35, 36. Smedley was quite close to him. Anyway, so this is a visit of Mao, and that's where this picture comes from.
The writer that you mentioned, can you please repeat his name? And is this the same writer that Mao was also very close to?
Well, Mao quotes him all the time. Mao barely ever, I'm not even sure he ever met him. Lu Xun, is the spelling that the Chinese use today is Xun, Luxun, Lu Xun. There are earlier kinds of spelling of the second name, you might say, but he's still very influential, and critical essays and little short novelettes and poetry and everything else. And yes, Mao praised him like crazy. I doubt he would have liked what happened. He was much more independent, and wasn't really a communist himself, although close to a number of them. Smedley and he knew German, and he and Smedley introduced Kathy Kowitz's woodcut carvings, which was became a big thing in China, Chinese art at that time.
Wow.
So it's amazing. I mean, the thing she had her fingers in, right?
It's incredible.
Talk about it that way. But anyway, the relationship with Madame Sung became this sort of major figure, but there's no, Chiang Kai-shek was getting people assassinated, like I say, one of the figures here, here and there. But how could he assassinate his sister-in-law, right? So, you could kind of gather around her, and Smedley was associated with her a lot at this time. So she really got into the middle of a very high level, both intellectual and political. And she had some Chinese lovers along the line. As Smedley said about this time, look, I live like a man, and what she meant was she sleeps with whoever she wants to, whenever she wants to. It was sort of her posture at this time. Although, we've talked already about the whole abortion issue.
Well, you make the nice point in your chapter on her psychoanalysis in Berlin, that the psychoanalysis helped her accept that she was basically kind of a polyamorous sort of person, and that was fine. That was,
yes. I think she did accept that. I think that's right. Yeah. I think that's a good point.
Maybe the psychoanalysis helped her overcome some of the social taboos. On that. So tell us about how she gets linked up with the Red Army, because she goes on assignment. She was one of the only Western journalists during the Chinese Revolution that as far as I understand, that was an embedded journalist for such a long duration, documenting and reporting on the war.
Yeah, well, she that's right. It's a bit complicated. In Shanghai, she would because what was called extraterritoriality, foreigners were protected from arrest by Chiang Kai-shek's government, and so she hid leading figures in the Red Army in her apartment, and or would arrange for them to be hid in other more innocent foreigners' apartments at times. And so her connection with these Red Army figures was considerable. There was no foreigners who actually went up to the initial Red Army base. There was one Russian advisor. Take that back. But other than that, but she got all kinds of material on this, and so on her first book, what's it called? Maybe Red Army Marches, perhaps, or something like that. Published in 1934, was about the Jiangxi base where Mao and Zhu De were organizing. She couldn't physically actually go there. She will go soon thereafter to their next base after the Long March, definitely. But anyway, that book was the first book in English with an international audience about this Jiangxi base of peasant uprising, basically. Not the urban model. See, the Chinese communists had been following classical Marxist directions of organizing in the big cities, the workers, labor unions, etc., all of which failed pretty badly, and many were killed. And so Mao runs off, connects up with Zhu De in this place. Anyway, this book was the first book in English to be banned in China by Chiang Kai-shek's government. They took note of it very quickly. But it is a kind of classic of itself. It's a little shrill if you read it in retrospect about the Red Army, and of course, maybe not totally accurate in all respects. But it certainly was important. And this is way before before Edgar Snow and Red Star over China, which was another big book about the communists. But that came much later, or 4 or 5 years later.
So when she first meets Mao, tell us about that experience. And she was embedded with Mao's contingent and living in the cave, which is, you can see this photograph with Mao, and you see a little says coffee on there on the table there. So they're having coffee.
Yes.
The other gentleman is Chu Te. That's the famous military general of the Red Army, which Agnes Smedley went on to write his biography, which we can
Mhm.
talk about in a moment. But tell us about her first encounter with Mao's contingent.
Yeah, so she had a major interview with Mao, with one of the first by a Western journalist, that about ideas of a kind of united front against the Japanese, and that it was a sort of soft projection of the class conflict idea within the communist movement. He talked about democracy a little vaguely, but anyway, in that direction. But she saw Mao personally as kind of aloof, sort of distant. This was through, of course, translators. Smedley knew some Chinese, but there were many dialects and so on. And in fact, Mao, nobody ever understood Mao when he gave a speech in China anyway. He had a heavy dialect. So unless you were from his hometown, you really couldn't understand him anyway. But she had translators that are not in that picture helping her at that point. But she saw him as distant and aloof, and as she describes him in Battle Hymn of China, for instance, uh, as sort of feminine. There's something about him that she didn't trust. Uh, and he was a tall man. I mean, he's not physically, wimpish exactly, but saw him as as a, as a kind of funny delicacy about him, or distant, uh, compared
Right.
to Jude on her right, who was older by about almost 20 years than Mao, 15 or so, who had been a warlord at one point before he became a communist, had the peasant background and so on. She really admired military men in many respects, which comes back to even as time went on, and so she was a little ambiguous about Mao, and not really exactly on the bandwagon with Mao. There is an incident in our book about Mao, her translator's relationship with Mao. A woman named she called Lily Wu Guangwei, and Smedley gets in trouble over that with Mao's wife, because Mao is probably having an affair with the translator, and Mao's wife gets upset and blames Smedley for it, one thing or another. And that's an episode in our book that has been translated and spread wide inside China, never citing us at all. Doesn't say
Mm,
where it comes from, but this story is well known in China. But it comes out of our book first, because
yeah.
were able to get. Smedley wrote some letters about it, as did later Edgar Snow. Anyway, we could
Yeah.
document it, and then we asked some Chinese in the '70s about it, and they said, "My God, you know the story, that kind of thing." So
So
we know
you and
we
your
know
wife
it's true.
really broke the story in some ways.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to. I take credit for it.
Well, it's so told so vividly, because you can just see it's in an intimate setting. It's in these caves. They're they're all outlaws,
Right.
and and you know this was during the time, by the way, that Smedley was introducing dancing,
That's
like
right.
right, like the two step and all of these American country
Mhm.
dances.
She's trying to loosen them up.
Yeah, and it apparently was popular. Popular.
Yes, especially with the guys, and they had these hardened wives that had been with them, who were less impressed, of course, or a little more suspicious. Although Smedley kept a relationship with some of them, like with Jude's wife, we interviewed later in China in the late
Hmm,
'70s,
hmm.
and she was quite okay with Smedley. People Chinese tell me all the time, "Oh, Smedley must have had an affair with Jude." I don't think so, because partially because of the way the wife behaved, about it. But anyway, who knows?
So tell us about her relationship with the general here, Trudeau. It sounds like it was they really bonded, and you see it in the book, her
Yes.
biography of him, which is I mean, it's such an incredible book. I think everyone should read it, because it's so painful. You start off, and she says, "Look, I'm sitting down, and I'm asking this person to do an oral memory transcription of his life." And at first you notice that as a peasant, first of all, many of the female peasants weren't even given names.
That's right.
They didn't even have a sort of individuality.
No, they didn't. They usually just had a surname. Yeah, that's
Right. So there's so much trauma that you can tell they had spent so many hours talking about his life that it just opened things up. And I'm sure he tapped into things that he didn't even know he knew or remembered through the process.
That's right. And he, good point. And he had been in Europe a little bit, so there may have been some German that they could use. It would have been German, but again through a translator. And yes, he got into it more in a way than Mao did. Although there was Edgar Snow had this interview with Mao, a kind of scripted view of Mao's life, I think. But yes, as he got into it, and much later, when Smedley was out of China in 45, 46, Judah passed her notes and so on, more about his life to help with the biography. I mean, he did get into it. You're right. As time went on, and they really did identify, as you say, I think, with the hard knock rural life, and coming out of that, and the misery of the peasantry, and so on. I think the Chinese, maybe again Mao because he was more distant, but people like Judah were moved by Smedley's actions vis-a-vis Chinese soldiers and so on. She would just jump in and try to bandage up badly banged up with terrible diseases of one kind or another that, we would all be, oh my God, I'm going to catch this thing if I embrace this guy and so on. I mean, she physically tried to help soldiers all around her in many situations, and I
that's
think
very interesting.
That impressed somebody like.
Well, that's very interesting, but the Chinese Communist Party denied her application.
They did.
Remember. So why do you think they denied her?
Well, it probably wasn't Judah. They did. Yes, she desperately after a point did want to join, and they denied it. I think maybe a little bit because of the message from Moscow that she was totally unreliable, which is what Moscow certainly thought by that time. But also that what they told her was she'd be much more effective as an international spokesperson, and she shouldn't be associated with them directly, and so that was the line. But it was very upsetting to her, very emotionally upsetting. She really threw a tantrum, so to speak, and it was very upsetting to her. But she was told not by Judah, but by people, and it probably was a decision coming from Mao and maybe Mr. Zhou Enlai, who of course she knew as well, who ultimately was the premier and everything in the People's Republic of China.
So her book on the general is still read in China today?
Oh yeah, yes, definitely. It's exists in translation, of course. She had some difficulty getting it published in the States in the 50s, as you might suppose. And it was published ultimately by the Monthly Review Press. And Jack Belden and Edgar Snow and so on sort of edited the final bit in Europe after she died. Remember, she died in 1950 suddenly. Right. And it was not yet published. So they got it to the Monthly Review Press, which of course is not a mainstream
right
press.
We just had one of their main editors onto our podcast recently for a conversation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, John Bellamy Foster. Yeah. So she has this experience in China. She's one of the topmost Western journalists covering the situation, but she does make it back to the United States. At the Second World War is now concluded. The rise of this pernicious McCarthyist Red Scare is going on. She's being persecuted by J. Edgar Hoover, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that experience? She's living in upper state New York in Woodstock at a writer's
Yaddo, it's
residence.
called Yaddo. It still exists as a writer's
Yeah,
up near near anyway. There's a women's college right up there.
that's right.
Anyway, uh, in at Yaddo. Yes, she comes back to the U.S. Her health was always kind of shaky, and the way she lived is not too surprising. But she comes back in just before Pearl Harbor. She was in Hong Kong for a while, just before Pearl Harbor, and there were some funny incidents with the British authorities in Hong Kong. But anyway,
So she comes back before the U.S. actually engages in the war.
Yeah, before Pearl Harbor.
Ah, okay. I thought she came back. Okay, got it.
Just before Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
Partially because of her health, and partially, I guess, to get this next, and in some ways, her most widely read in the U.S. book anyway, the Battle Hymn of China, put together, but also to do public speaking and so on, which was building in the U.S. Against the Japanese and what they were doing in China, and so forth. And she was pretty much of a celebrity at this time. I mean, she hung out with Hemingway,
right. Robert Lowell.
Yeah. Well, Robert Lowell got quite angry with her, but earlier with Hemingway in Hong Kong, I think, or around in that area.
Yeah, there's the whole Robert Lowell affair at Yaddo.
Yes, and so she is hanging out by 1944, and she again, like always, didn't have much money, was dependent one way or another, and she became a kind of writer in residence at this Yaddo place. And Robert Lowell eventually is there as well. And the FBI is following her now all the time. And the secretary, it turns out, at Yaddo was writing weekly reports what Smedley was doing, sending it to the FBI. We got her FBI papers, at least much of it crossed out, but it was about 4 feet high,
And,
and
they all thought she was a Russian spy.
Yes, that's right. That was the idea, and they were kept writing things about her after she was dead. I mean, she was still dangerous apparently until 1954, and so Robert Lowell was very much on, and I don't understand that much about Robert Lowell. There's a good biography of him, but it doesn't get into his politics very much. But he got on the bandwagon that Smedley should be kicked out of this place for being a dangerous communist. And so it split the writers, because there was a variety of writers there. The Southern woman writer was very sympathetic with Smedley. They became good friends. I forget right now what's her name.
Is it Evans? No, it's not Evans.
It's a Southern woman writer at that time, and I was going to say Carson, but that's wrong. Anyway, there was a big split, and the director of the Yaddo was sort of dependent on Smedley. She was having her own nervous breakdown, and so on. And the board, Malcolm Cowley, and all these people got kind of pulled into this thing. And I think it was a sort of a stain on Robert Lowell, if you ask me. I've been less appreciative of his poetry ever since, about all of this. But anyway, she was kicked out of Yaddo, and so she then kind of wanders around, and she, for a while, lives near Edgar Snow, which is in New York, up the Pacific Palisades Highway there, before you get to Nyack, a writer's colony kind of in there, and some other friends, sort of supported her, but she was increasingly harassed by the FBI, and couldn't publish either by 1948 much of anywhere and even as I said, the communists also publications were giving her a bad time for different reasons. And this is Evans Carlson, Carlson's Raiders, who she became very close to And they may have been lovers in 1938, 39. But he was very straight, kind of a sort of Lutheran background guy, a Marine, and he got involved and very impressed by the guerrilla tactics of the communists. And as a military attaché in 1938, 39, studied Chinese, wrote a little bit about it, but became really famous later in John Wayne movies and everything else for the gung ho and the I forget which island was it, Iwo Jima.
Well, he was at Guadalcanal.
Guadalcanal, that's it. Yeah.
And the Macon's raid, Macon's Island.
Yeah, and he died suddenly in 1946 or 7,
and this is a photo of her giving a eulogy at his funeral. Yeah,
that's right. And he became a big anti-Chiang Kai-shek guy by this time.
Well, he was also, I mean, he was pretty much a socialist. I mean, it's amazing that it's one of the most decorated Marines that there is. I mean, this you could say he's like a Captain America. I mean, he fought in World War I. He was decorated. He got two Purple Hearts. I mean, they should make a Hollywood film about him today.
Well, maybe there's this guy named Stephen Platt, who's a good writer, who right now is in the middle of trying to putting together a biography that he sent me some parts of, that in which Smedley is featured a fair amount because they were close.
So they were close in China.
Smedley maybe had a really big influence on him. I mean, he came out of a kind of religious, Oregon, New England sort of background. I don't think he ever actually was a communist per se, but enormously sympathetic with the Chinese communist movement, and so became vilified, of course, at the Marines. I mean, sometimes if you look him up on Wikipedia, you may see that he was a terrible Marine communist or something. This kind of charge, like he's controversial, I guess, in some quarters in the military.
But where did they first meet?
They first met. They first met, I believe, in Hankow in 1938 when he was the military attaché there, and Smedley had just come from Yan'an. And the Japanese and the Chinese were fighting like crazy, and they went out together to the front lines. And sometimes the Chinese would let him go out and not let her go out because she was a woman, Although she carried a 6-gun and would use it, I mean, but anyway, but they became very close, and then they were not in Yan'an together, but they traveled together, covering the activities of the Chinese army, mostly Chiang Kai-shek's army, against the Japanese a number of times, and she helped get him to Yan'an to meet Mao and company, but they weren't literally there together.
Wow.
But they stayed very much in touch because this guy Platt has uncovered all kinds of correspondence, as far more than we knew they were close, but he really has documented how much they were kind of in touch with each other right to the end. So he was like her in a way. He's a little hard to categorize in an absolute, ideological way. Although he was not, he had gone to college and so on. I mean, he was not from a peasant background, like the American peasant or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's just fascinating because his tactics that he introduced to the Marine Corps would go on to be actually quite influential, and just to think that is owed to Mao, his observation of Maoist guerrilla tactics is something that's quite interesting to think about.
He also shared her admiration for Zhu De, I think. I mean, I think that, and some of the other generals, but Zhu De as well.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So could you talk about the final years of Smedley's life? There have been some rumors that her persecution, she fell ill. Was there any foul play?
Well, that's an interesting point. She had a lot of trouble with her stomach and ulcers and this and that, uh, and she left to go. In fact, the new government in China apparently gave her the money to get a boat ticket out. I got that pretty well documented because I knew the guy who gave her the money, and so she goes to England, where she had some friends dating back to Hong Kong, medical people, uh, and her stomach kind of fell apart, and she had an operation in Oxford actually with good doctors. I mean, so and she never really recovered from that operation. But the press suggested foul play on both sides. The Chinese said that the American government killed her. The American government said that the Chinese killed her because she was going to come back and testify about all the terrible things, that spying and devious activities of the Russians and the Chinese. And of course, at that time, Washington thought the Chinese and the Russians were totally in bed together and were the same thing, essentially. So there were accusations like this even through her death.
Mhm.
I don't think there was foul play, but anyway, there was ultimately her ashes made it to China almost about a year later.
Mm.
And that by that time the Korean War, she died before the Korean War started, although
Mm.
she sort of predicted it in one of her last writings.
Yeah.
Uh, but and so in 51 the Korean War was underway, and Chinese and American troops were confronting each other and so on and so forth. So that there was a ceremony with her ashes, not a real big one, but still publicized. And her grave is in the most important graveyard in China, the sort of revolutionary heroes graveyard outside of Beijing, with an inscription from Judo. I guess I could have shown. We should have shown that picture, but
Oh,
anyway, uh, so she became iconic, and in the 50s and 60s, Daughter of Earth was the main text in English classes in China. Now, mostly they were studying Russian, of course, but on into the 60s, when I first showed up in China in the 60s and 70s, they all knew Daughter of Earth because anybody who studied English in college, and they were beginning to do that more and more. And then, of course, this is a stamp, an official stamp of her. But there are
wow.
statues of her here and there. There's a Lu Xun Museum in Beijing with a statue of her because she was close to this guy Lu Xun, and so on. And I even by Zoom today, I participate in Agnes Smedley events in Beijing, and I
Wow.
get invited to them all the time.
Yeah.
I I went on a Red Army march with them in 2018, and it was about I was doing the Agnes Smedley Act along with some others about other aspects of
Huh.
foreign involvement and so on. So her reputation lives on enormously in China, but her books translated into Korean, various Indian languages, Spanish, of course, German. I mean, in the feminist movement too, she's important. There is a school of thought which I don't really buy into, that she was actually a lesbian.
Mm.
Uh, uh, I don't really think so. She had some close women friends, of course,
Hmm.
but I don't think that's particularly true. But uh,
Yep.
and also I don't think it matters very much.
Right.
But but anyway, so she has become, yes, internationally, as I said at the beginning of this, her reputation outside of the United States is considerable. And in the 50s, her books were all withdrawn from libraries all over the country, uh, and have reappeared only kind of in reprints or something, you know. So there was about ban the books, which
Right.
we're into in a different way today, right?
Right.
But anyway, so she really suffered from that point of view. And the only way I got my university here at Arizona State to agree to be a home to her papers in the 70s was that I said, look, we've got her papers. Why not here? This is where she had started, and so on. And they said, well, but she was a communist, wasn't she? Blah blah blah. And to the head archivist and so on, was worried about leaders above him. And I said, okay. Fortunately, in 1976, Life magazine, as it was beginning to die out, had a special issue on 100 great American women. And there was Agnes Smedley. And so I said to the guy, look, is there any other graduate of this place that is in Life magazine is one of the 100 great American women? Can you name another one? No. Okay. All right. We'll take her papers. Now they're very proud of having her papers, and they digitized it, and the Chinese have come. Various levels of Chinese come to look at it over the years, and internationally, like this guy doing the Carlson book I just talked about. He spent 2 weeks looking at her papers, So it is, been a good home. But anyway, it shows you the atmosphere from the 50s up through the 70s anyway.
Sure.
About and why that helps to explain what you said at the beginning, that she's somehow unknown.
Yeah.
The unknownness too, may, and I like to hear you talk about it, is maybe because she really wasn't an ideologue as much as some of the others, like Anna Louise Strong. You probably heard of her,
right?
Would be it was a fascinating figure too. They knew each other, but much more of an ideologue.
Well, I think this is a good point, because in an alternate universe, she could have, when she's being persecuted by the FBI, she's back in the United States, she could have enjoyed her late years by renouncing all of the political ideologies of socialism and communism that were so important to her, but she chose not to do that. She chose not to do that. But nor did she choose to become a staunch party ideologue, right? So it's that kind of principled leftist commitment that I think is quite noble, or maybe even inspiring in a certain way, because it's so much more real for her, these commitments and these principles, than something you read in a book, right?
Right.
And she even was asked at some point, how much do you know about Marxism? She says, well, I actually don't know that much about Marxism, but that's not really what it was about for her. It wasn't really a theoretical thing. And that's kind of what drew me to her politics. I mean, she's such a complex person. There's the gender, the sexuality piece, there's her relationship with her father and the family and the patriarchy. But it is, I think, that lowly peasant class experience that really kept her principles pretty firm, as I see it.
That's a good summary. I think you're right, and that is maybe one reason why she still has an appeal. Right, through the various generations of sort of leftism, embracing certain outlooks and certain somewhat rigid approaches to social questions. She transcends that way, right? In a way she maybe didn't quite intend, but
well, and maybe that's why the communist leaders that she interacted with, from the senior Bolshevik leaders to the senior Maoist leaders, said maybe your best place in the socialist movement is to be an independent voice. Yeah, and that's really what she was.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's that really makes her an exceptional figure, and exceptional also for America, and also, frankly, for the future of America-Chinese relations. I think that, the meaning of China as a communist country, even though their communism is a lot different than what it was under Mao, that legacy, to have the knowledge of that legacy of Smedley and how she connected with the Chinese is such an important story, that people need to know about, in my opinion.
Well,
And
good. I'm really glad
yeah,
that you've been working on her and thinking about her.
well, I want to ask you your own personal, in conclusion of our conversation, if I might, tell us a little bit about your own first, visit to China. Did you go there during the Cultural Revolution?
Yes and no. The story is I got into Chinese studies as with a fascination with the history of China as a kind of blank slate in terms of Western knowledge of modern Chinese history, and so I in the early '60s began to study Chinese and wanted to pursue a PhD. And there was a lot of money available to pursue a PhD from the National Defense Foreign Language Grants from the Defense Department because China was the enemy, sort of enemy studies, which it was a very big deal. So I didn't have to borrow money or play games to go on to graduate school, and that was also made it possible, I suppose. And I started out in one of the few places that did China, which was at all seriously, which was Yale. And then I went on to anyway. I eventually got my degree in California, but I went to Hong Kong. First, I went to Taiwan because if you were studying China in the '60s as an American, you'd have to be shot down in a spy plane to actually visit China. I mean, it was impossible. So I went for a while to Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and then to Hong Kong. And my wife and I lived in Hong Kong during the Cultural Revolution in '67 to '68 into '69, '68 actually, which is when the Cultural Revolution was at its height. Hong Kong was supposed to kind of fall, which it didn't. But anyway, so we picked up a lot then. But I was involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and had started being involved earlier in '64 or '5 and so on. And we got back to Berkeley and we're right in the middle of it. Of course, again, a lot of demonstrations and, the whole. I was connected with a group called the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars. I don't know if you know about it, but there's now a book or two about it a little bit of people who were studying Asia, especially, East Asia, but also Asia generally, who were against the war, and we were trying to inform the public. But we were all young and graduate
So
students.
what was the environment like amidst the Cultural Revolution? Can you give us a sense of the feeling that it was like to be?
Well, I think my wife and I were partially sympathetic. We were pretty confused as to what the hell was going on. There were refugees coming into Hong Kong, and there were labor organizations in Hong Kong raising hell too, and we were not clear. I mean, the sloganizing was kind of scary, and the throwing all of these intellectuals into the countryside and so on. We began to know about, but not too much. I mean, we were somewhat. In retrospect, I realized I was somewhat snowed more by it than I would like to admit today. But anyway, I come back and end up going by '71, '72. It begins to be Nixon Kissinger thing is happening. And when Kissinger and Nixon went, a month later, I went to China with a group of anti-war leftists because Mao was still alive, and Joe and I was surrounded by two of what became known as the Gang of Four. And they were the left. And so I guess the deal was, okay, we'll let Kissinger and Nixon come, but we'll also have some American leftists come. So somehow I was in this group of about 25 of us. And so we went to China for almost 6 weeks in March, April of 1972. And then
Are there other folks that we might know in that group with you?
Yeah. Do you know Mark Selden or Jonathan Mirsky, perhaps? These are Mark Selden's still alive in New York. And not real famous people. Well, a guy named Bernstein who was a book review editor for the New York Times later. I don't know if you, what's his first name? Anyway, so we had a tour. We went to model what they call May 7th cadre schools, where intellectuals were put shoveling shit with the pigs and so on. And they all said they were happy. And, it was confusing, but some of us were still pretty empathetic. And when I went, the university here tried to fire me just for going to China. Now, Barry Goldwater was totally opposed, who was the senator, was totally opposed to any relation to China. So I came back with the FBI on me for going to China. Not about Agnes Smedley, but and had my own struggles in that respect. And so because of Agnes Smedley, however, and I'll just say, because we were working on Agnes Smedley, we developed friends with intellectuals, but also through Zhou Enlai, frankly, who we met in 1972. And he was dead by the 77, 78, but they started inviting us to come, and they invited us to come and work and live in China for a couple of years in the late 70s and early 80s with our children, and work on Agnes Smedley and interview people all over the place. And so we had a bunch of unique, of course, all these people have died since, and so it gave us unique accent. It was a very heady experience. I worked for the People's Daily, which is training their journalists to go abroad in 79. And one of my students was Bo Xilai, who was the chief competitor for Mr. Xi. You remember his wife killed an Englishman and all this stuff. I don't know if you remember that in 2009 and so on. And he was a very big shot, and the rival of Mr. Xi. And he's in prison now. Anyway, so somehow Agnes Smedley brought us into the middle,
right,
of a lot of heavy Chinese stuff, and I'm forever grateful, I guess. But anyway, I guess maybe that's for personally, we were certainly, engaged with her, and in some ways I still am. I am. I've written other books about the war, and I just finished a biography about. Actually, this guy was Agnes Smedley's closest Chinese friend, and was a remarkable figure in and of himself, named Chen Han-sung. But anyway, so I have. It's been quite an adventure, and sort of an accidental, I suppose you could say, adventure ourselves in how it all developed or where it took us. As time went on.
Well, it's really, really honored that you sat down with me to chat about your own journey, your research into Smedley, Agnes's life itself. And just for listeners, Steve's next book is entitled Chen Hansheng, China's Last Romantic Revolutionary. And that's coming out, I think, with Columbia University.
It's out now. Yeah.
I think on the website it says June.
No, well, that's because you can't buy it. It's not shipped in yet. But anyway, it's
out. Okay.
It's in print. Yeah.
So everybody should go pick it up.
Thank you.
And check it out. Your work on Smedley is fabulous. Everybody should read that as a great supplement to Daughter of Earth.
Thank you.
And of course, the great book on the general called The Great Road is a wonderful book as well. I haven't read the Battle Hymn, but I'm sure it's very interesting as well. But Anyways, this has been a pleasure. I think we'll conclude now. And thanks everybody for listening. And until next time.